I think this might be the first time where your crippling addiction to WoW Classic has actually caused us to have to record whilst you are simultaneously playing World of Warcraft.
Yes.
This might be a new low for this channel.
No, this is a steamy resident high of what we've been doing.
I don't know what that is, and I don't care to know. Stop paying Activision money. Just stop giving the money, Robert.
No.
What happened to all of those like private servers that you used to get? Do you even get those anymore?
They still exist, yeah, but I never played them. I don't have autism. Like, what the f***?
You're playing WoW Classic. If that's not autism, then that's at least Asperger's. I don't know.
Asperger's isn't a thing anymore, Dave. They've changed the, definitions and all that shit.
No.
Jeez. Are you not up to date with your contemporary, mental health and DSM? Like, come on, man.
Hey, check it out. We're actually going to be releasing a video that is going to come out before 6 months have expired since our last. That might be a new record for us over the last year or so. Speaking of us being really bad at this new video, it's going to be part of our least popular video series because I feel like the algorithm has been too nice to us recently. So let's tank the channel again, boys.
Hell yeah, bro.
It's a race to the bottom.
So, Dave, since you're complaining already about what we're recording and how it will affect the subscriptions, what are we reviewing today?
Depression Kino, boys. It's Depression Kino time.
It's always Depression Kino time.
You know, 'tis the season, Robert.
I mean, this is actually a Christmas film.
So we thought we should cover, a nice, heartfelt, cheerful, and uplifting Christmas movie.
I mean, what other Christmas movies have themes of suicide, apart from It's a Wonderful Life? The Santa Claus? That's just me watching it, though.
Yeah, we're doing Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, arguably the saddest Christmas movie ever made. I watched it for the first time last night, and I am indeed the big sad. So
it's a good movie.
Just right out the gate, I think it is worth mentioning that 1, there are going to be a fuckload of spoilers in this. 2, we're probably going to talk about a lot of history. And 3, seriously, if you haven't seen this yet and you don't want to be spoiled before you go any further, pause this video now, go and watch this film. This film is incredible.
This is one of my favorite movies of all time. I cannot highly recommend it enough. It's like a fever dream of good movie, basically. So Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence is a Japanese-English collaborated made film. It is the story of a prisoner of war camp in, I think it's Java, it's set. So it's about the story of Captain Yunai, and is he Captain Jack Sellers or is he Major Jack Sellers? I can never remember his rank.
Major, you are correct, you got that right.
So it's Major Jack Sellers and his conflict with the Japanese commandants. It has 2 other characters, Mr. Lawrence and Takeshi Kitano's character, which I cannot remember for the life of me his name right now, but I think it's Haro.
We'll go with Hara. Fuck it, it's fine. It's really not that important.
Anyway. But yeah, then roughly the story is basically the conflict between prisoners and the Japanese in charge of the camp. And no homo is how I'll sum up the rest of the plot.
I think you'll find there is quite a bit of homo, actually.
No. Do you not hear him right at the start in the subtitles that says no homo?
Maybe that's in the Senjuku Code. I don't know. You never know. Stranger things about
it's the last line of the Bushido Code. It literally just says no homo.
As Rob say. It's a World War II movie, but not your usual sort of affair where it's, dramatic war stories and stuff. It's a much more cerebral, slow burner of a film about British, well, not just British, actually.
Allied prisoners of war, isn't it?
Yeah, Allied prisoners of war held captive under Imperial Japanese commandants and Imperial Japanese conditions. Most of it is kind of done from the perspective of Lieutenant Colonel John Lawrence, who is an inmate fluent in Japanese and who actually seems to have quite a bit of respect for Japanese culture. During the arrival of the character that Rob mentioned, Major Jack Sellers, played by David Bowie, who just absolutely is not down for playing by any of the rules that the Japanese commandants are trying to enforce. Not helped by the fact that the main sort of leader of the Japanese guards, Captain Yunai, is kind of obsessed with Sellers in a definitely no homo way, shall we say. And then it all ends very, very badly for most of the parties involved, and it is the big sad. This is a historical movie, so I think it's important that before we actually dive into the movie properly, we try and maybe set the context a little bit for Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, and the events in which it's taking place. Because I don't know about you, but this is certainly true from my experience. The Pacific War is not one that I feel is as well known as the fighting that went on in Europe at around the same time. I think it's one that's quite often overlooked.
Well, they did call it at the time the Forgotten Front. That's historic, is what they used to call it.
Turns out the issue with recording all of this in a single live session and then trying to stitch it together into something coherent later is that if one of us is off our game, the whole thing falls apart. Rob was on fire when we recorded this video, credit where credit is due, especially when it came to the history stuff. Me, though, holy hell, was I talking complete and utter pish the entire time. So, editing Dave here, with a different microphone because my house is currently a building site and the mic isn't set up, here to fix things in post because I'm an idiot who doesn't learn from past mistakes no matter how often this happens. Can you give me kind of a broad brushstrokes summary of the rise of Imperial Japan?
The Meiji Restoration, roughly, is the restoring of the emperor to being the head of state, so it wipes out what was called the shogunate. The emperor seizes control. He leads Japan into basically industrialization. It is the wiping out of a lot of old culture. It's the wiping out the samurais, and basically this leads to the Japanese starting to invade China, Korea, kicking the shit out of Russia, and then during the First World War, the Japanese are on side with the Allied forces. So the Japanese Navy helps patrol the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, seizes German colonies on the Caroline, the Marshalls, and the Marianas Islands. This was all part of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, and basically Japan during this time period saw rapid growth and expansion of its imperial power. After World War I, the Japanese are involved with stamping out communism because they do the whole Siberian and invade. However, the Americans don't support them, the British don't support them, so they eventually have to withdraw their forces. This starts the slow decline and eventual isolation that the Japanese take upon themselves. I think it's called Taisho democracy. It's like the liberalization of Japan, and that basically ends with a whole bunch of people being assassinated. Because after this period we're talking about is the rise of fascism within Japan. Fascism maybe is not the right word. I suppose it's more what they call, the Japanese called Showa statism, but basically it's Japanese ultranationalism if you want to label it, but it's fascism in terms of
who they're allied with.
Yeah, it's not that different from I'm going to say European style fascism, but it isn't that different. It just isn't as codified. It's hard to actually write down this is what they believed, when literally what they believed was Japan first. That's about it.
One of the reasons why it's very vague and probably a little confusing is because it was vague and probably a little confusing to the people living in there at the time.
And there was also the fact there was 40 different prime ministers in about 6 months as well. So it's
yeah, because they keep fucking killing them.
Yeah, but they shouldn't have been cringe. Well, by this point that we're talking about in the film, they've actually seized the majority of the industrial areas of China. So by this point, they've already reached the largest extent of their advance, I believe.
And they do some really, really, really fucked up things in China.
Let's not delve into that.
It's really bad. We talk about some of the bad stuff that they do to Allied prisoners of war and stuff. At least some of them survive. Because by the time that 1941, 1942 rolls around, they have been at war in China for about 10 years. So by rights, there should be massive prisoner of war camps where all of these captured Chinese soldiers that they've taken in battle should be getting housed and cared for and looked after and stuff. And you go, hey, Imperial Japan, where are all of those Chinese prisoners that you really ought to have by now? And Imperial Japan goes... Japan's plan as they entered into World War II properly was, to put it mildly, a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for them. They knew that war with Britain was all but inevitable, but instead of just focusing on Britain, they decided they were going to fight literally everyone except the Russians. They did not want to fight the Russians. I've seen some historians and commentators refer to it as completely bonkers, but there was an underlying logic to it. It's just that if it went wrong, they were fucked from there on out. The strategy, in broad brushstrokes, went a little something like this. Step 1. Smash the US Pacific Fleet and seize as much territory from the Allies as possible. Step 2. Fortify this captured territory, turning all these islands into a ring of defenses around the Japanese home islands. Step 3. Scream, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough, as loudly as possible. Their hope was that this ring of defenses would wear the enemy down over time, and that ultimately the Allies wouldn't be willing to suffer the losses needed to recapture it all. The trouble was, people did indeed want to come and have a go. The Americans certainly did. The Brits did too once they'd got their shit together after Singapore. And you know who else did? The Australians. I don't want to compliment the Imperial Japanese Navy too much, since it was technically a war crime. Admiral Yamamoto, you're supposed to tell the enemy you're at war with them before you start bombing their fleets. But it's hard not to be impressed by what they achieved at Pearl Harbor. The level of coordination, planning, and logistics required to get the Kido Butai all the way across to Hawaii without being detected makes my dumb little brain hurt. Then, when you consider the fact that Pearl Harbor was just step one of a multi-phase attack launched on the Allies, you start to realize that the Japanese military was pretty scary when it came to this war business.
Pearl Harbor happens on the 7th of December, right? They attack Shangasa in China at the same time. They attack Malaya the next day. They attack Borneo the next day. They attacked Hong Kong the next day. They attacked the Philippines the next day.
It's so perfectly coordinated.
Yes.
It's incredible.
The sheer rapidity of Japanese offense in the Pacific is insane.
This brings me into what I wanted to talk to you about, because again, I haven't covered Singapore as much, but I think this is quite relevant to the movie that we're talking about, because it's specifically mentioned by both Lawrence, I think Hixley as well, that these are soldiers who were taken after the siege of Singapore. Singapore was supposed to be Britain's greatest foothold in the Asian theatre, the Gibraltar of the East, as Churchill kept insisting on calling it. But to steal a line from Sarah Kovner's book, Prisoners of the Empire, Britain was trying to defend it on the cheap. Singapore was under-equipped, undersupplied, and undermanned, and the only solution offered that the UK could use reinforcements from the rest of its empire was never going to work when the rest of its empire was on fucking fire.
Roughly, the British defences were facing the wrong way. That's the most important thing. They were not, like, genuinely, they were pointed the wrong direction. The defences were then, they placed a load of supplies and logistics on the beaches, but the British were fighting on the roads. The Japanese were more mobile because they had bicycles, and the Allies did not. So the Japanese were able to cover more ground quickly. The Allies did not have air support properly, whereas the Japanese did. Essentially, the whole fall of Singapore is just like really rapid advance by a country with no motorized vehicles. Essentially, it's the best way to describe it. And that's why the British fail completely. Because Singapore is always often described as like the Gibraltar of the Far East, but it's not as defended as people make it out to be. Yes, it had a huge naval base. The naval base wasn't defended because the Western Allies didn't respect what they might be fighting over there.
Mind how I said I screwed this recording session up royally? For further evidence of this, look no further than the fact that I forgot to talk about bloody Bushido. You know, only one of the first things people think about when they think of Imperial Japan in World War II. Bushido is both a historical concept or code that goes all the way back to Japan's Edo period, a topic I am entirely unqualified to talk about, but also a military code that Japan's leaders hope to use to try and foster a new military culture as they rearmed in the Meiji Restoration era. To quote Sarah Kovner again, they chose to adopt the values of the samurai class. Since Japan had seen little conflict for some 250 years, samurai, who comprised only a small percentage of the population, mostly worked as bureaucrats and clerks during that time. Samurai ideals, therefore, needed to be created anew. I didn't run this by Rob, so I'm sure he's gonna hate it, but the best analogy I can think of to explain the adoption of Bushido is for you to imagine that an early 20th century European country decides that its soldiers are going to follow the code of chivalry. That's gonna be their guiding star, their principles of conduct. But wait a minute, you say. The chivalric code hasn't been around for literal centuries. No one alive has ever practiced it in its original form. Don't worry, says the country as it hands you a piece of paper. We've recreated it perfectly. You look at the piece of paper and go, this just says war crimes are based and also our soldiers aren't allowed to surrender. And the country responds, ail them out. That's Bushido, essentially. And it led to one of the most defining images we still have of the Japanese soldier in World War II, that of a fanatical, seemingly fearless warrior who simply would not give up.
This is an interesting one because our most common examples of it were given in the West, and I'm saying in the West with big quotation marks here, is through movies. So the Japanese attitude to surrender is kind of seen as dishonorable. The main thing we're showing is oh, if you surrender, it's basically you're giving up. It's seen as not as a chance thing. It's you've given up, so it's better to have died. So depictions in many films that some of us will have seen, for example, Flags for Our Fathers, The Pacific, it all shows the Japanese just giving one last banzai charge of honor to die rather than be taken prisoner. And people oh, that's only something that happens. No, that's genuinely what they did.
The casualty rates show this. Up until about 1945, the rates at which you get Japanese prisoners are minuscule. These guys will kill themselves rather than surrender. That is a proven statistic.
The thing need to understand, and this is my forgiving the Japanese for the war crimes moment. The Japanese captured all these men. Japan already had a basically famine problem because they had a rice shortage in Japan because of what was going on in China. They captured all these men and they couldn't afford to feed them.
This brings us to the crux of what we're trying to say about the Japanese treatment of their prisoners, particularly in how it compared to treatment by other Axis powers. Only the most die-hard members of groups like Nippon Kaigi, the chief peddlers of Japanese war crime denialism, several of whom are elected members of the Japanese government right now, only these people would claim that Japan did nothing wrong in their treatment of POWs. It was bad. Bold statements only on this channel. But the key differences between Japan and, let's say, Germany is that of intention and pre-planning. Germany was actively seeking to wipe out whole swathes of the population of Eastern Europe, a policy set by a certain Austrian painter whose name I'm not allowed to say anymore because this is a great video sharing platform, you guys. This policy carried over into their approach towards POWs taken on the Eastern Front. The number of deaths it resulted in makes my head hurt. We are talking millions of Eastern European POWs intentionally starved, executed, or worked to death. All of this pre-planned and mandated from on high by the leaders of Germany. Japan, meanwhile, was not planning to intentionally mistreat and massacre its prisoners. Hell, it wasn't fucking planning. Japan had been caught with its pants down before when it came to figuring out how to deal with POWs. For example, in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and also during World War I. On both occasions, they struggled, and that was when they were only dealing with a few thousand prisoners. Now, all of a sudden, they were dealing with at least 100,000. Despite this, there was pretty much nothing in the way of policy mandated by Japanese authorities. And even if they had tried to set policies, they had no institutional capacity to ensure they were being carried out. POW camps were, on paper, regulated by the Prisoner of War Management Office, a purely bureaucratic entity that had absolutely zero control over what went on in the camps they were meant to be overseeing. They didn't know, and they didn't want to know. Essentially, having suddenly found themselves responsible for hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, Japan decided to fucking wing it.
The people being put in charge of these camps are not what you would call the cream of the crop.
They aren't sending their best.
These are the fuck-ups. These are the people they don't trust. These are the people they want out the way in a jungle in Java, for instance.
To once again do past Dave's job for him and wrap this overlong section up, I'm hoping you guys have a clearer picture now of what these Japanese prison camps were like and how they got to such a state. These were overlooked, under-regulated areas of military governance, one that the central authorities of Japan had next to no interest in managing. You had commandants with absolutely no oversight or supervision, and guards who were hardly what you could call the cream of the Japanese army, essentially being given the power of life and death over their prisoners. Inevitably, this brought out what we can politely call the extremities of human behavior. Man at his very best and his very worst. Also, seriously, fuck you, past Dave.
Maybe we should talk about the fucking movie, Dave.
Yeah, maybe we should. This is a lot of preamble for a talk about a film. Holy fuck, this is going to take a while to cut down. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence is a 1983 war movie about a bunch of British prisoners of war in Java in December 1942 having a very, very sad time. When I was going into this movie, two sort of main things that I knew about it was, one, David Bowie is in it. Two, it is about Allied prisoners of war in Japan. And three, it's a little bit sad in some places as well, because I think you mentioned that too. Other than that, I didn't really know too much about what to expect. The thing that really, really struck me in comparison to other movies that I've watched about Imperial Japan and the Japanese in World War II in general is just how nuanced and balanced is maybe not the right word, because it is certainly critical of the way the Japanese are behaving, but it is a very empathetic look at who the Japanese are in this film as well, because these are not strange alien monsters. These are very, very complicated and interesting people, the Japanese characters in this. I mean, obviously, Hara and Yanoi are the two main focuses, but these are fascinating men.
Even the characters of Lawrence, as well as Sellers. Yeah, Sellers.
Celliers, I think it's pronounced.
Celliers?
I don't know. Is he meant to be Australian or South African? I'm not really sure what's going on with the accent
Right,
there.
if I remember rightly, he is supposed to be Australian, but David Bowie's doing a really bad Australian accent that comes across as South African. Don't even know where to really begin, other than saying, you just need to go and watch this film to listen to the soundtrack. That's where you start with this film, right? Is this soundtrack is fucking amazing.
I did not realize how iconic this soundtrack was until until the opening credits are playing and the theme of Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, composed by the same man who plays Captain Yonoi, Ryuichi Sakamoto. I'm like, holy shit, I have heard this before. That's this song. This came from this movie. Oh my goodness.
And if I remember rightly, the other bit you'll have heard it from is the mandolin part in Losing My Religion by R.E.M.
It's like this soundtrack is really, really fucking iconic. It's weird that. Again, David Bowie is the one that everyone focuses on because David Bowie is in this fucking movie and it's David fucking Bowie and he's very, very good in this. When we talked about Ryuichi Sakamoto and when we were talking about Royal Space Force, I think this is an area that I kind of fucked up in terms of my discussion because I did not realize how important and iconic his band Yellow Magic Orchestra was. Those guys are pretty fucking iconic, it turns out. And this was like at the height of their popularity after they kind of exploded in terms of their prominence, both in Japan and internationally as well. But this is Ryuichi Sakamoto at the height of his fame, in the same way that it's Bowie kind of at the height of his fame as well. This for me, the 80s are peak Bowie. Holy fuck, he is good looking in this movie, by the way. Goddamn. It should have been pretty obvious given that the movie is called Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, but the thing that we all focus on is David Bowie is in this movie.
He's not the main character. Lawrence is the main character.
Yeah, he really is. And Tom Conti, the guy who plays John Lawrence, is so good. Interesting thing I found out as well, he doesn't speak Japanese. He didn't learn Japanese for this movie. They taught all his lines phonetically and he delivered them that way. But he's the heart of this movie. Like,
he holds
Lawrence
it all together.
He's the guy that all of these people are confessing things to and discussing things with.
He's the reason they all come together, if you will, because he's the translator.
But he's also, he represents this caliber of British officer that we were talking about earlier. I think you've got two kind of main, other than Celliers, of course, you've got two British officers in this movie who are in the camp. You've got Group Captain Hixley, he's an RAF boy. He's your stiff upper lip, British, rah, 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 rah. These Japanese are nothing to really be concerned about, blah, 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 blah. I don't understand my enemy. I don't want to understand my enemy. I am bound by the Geneva Conventions. You need to treat me properly, even when he's surrounded by evidence that they have no fucking intention of doing that whatsoever. Meanwhile, Lawrence represents this slightly younger, newer breed of officer, someone who has spent time in Japan, someone who speaks Japanese, and who has a real love and respect for the Japanese people. I think that's one of the things that why an ultra-nationalist like Captain Yonoi quite likes Lawrence, because they can talk about things that they love about Japan. Like that's this interesting scene that they have where they're talking about the snow in Japan falling and how Lawrence thinks that's one of the most beautiful parts of the country.
And one of the things that's brought up about Yonoi's character, just briefly, is that he should have been at the Young Officers coup. It's briefly mentioned that he should have been there, but he was elsewhere, was he not?
He'd been deployed to Manchuria at the time, but they know he's associated with it. They know he sympathizes with it. And so he is never trusted by the authorities again.
Which is why he has this shitty job of guarding Java.
Even though he is very clearly quite an efficient officer, a very staunch believer in principles such as the Bushido Code and the likes, and the values that the Imperial Japanese Army espouse. He's got this dead-end shit posting out in the middle of Java. And it's a thing that he expresses himself on several occasions, this regret that he has, that he was not there, that he did not die alongside his fellow officers for what he believed in. That's something that he is haunted by him, that hangs over him. And it's something that very, very interestingly parallels the other kind of main character that we have in this movie, Major Jack Strafer Celliers, who is... How would you describe the character of Celliers in this? Like, we described him as kind of this obstinate guy who's not really willing to play ball by the Japanese authorities. He feels almost borderline kind of self-destructive and suicidal.
The way I've read about it being depicted is when he gets shot at, Celliers himself dies. And he views himself as a dead man, because every moment from that point onwards is him goading the Japanese into attacking and killing him, because he believes he should already have been shot. And Bowie plays a maniacal madman. Great.
Yeah, he does. He's really fucking... Like, everyone in this is really, really fucking good, but Bowie in particular, like, just that devil-may-care, that urge to thumb his nose at the people who are in charge of him and just dare them to do something about it, which ultimately someone does eventually call his bluff on that one, but we'll get to that in a bit. Yonoi's whole motivation throughout this movie is that he is absolutely obsessed with Celliers in a...
It's depicted, some people say it's as a romantic way, but it's infatuation.
Yes,
Watching him
it's
sleep.
not romantic because it's not reciprocated.
He's not like interacting with Celliers either. He's watching him from afar. He's watching him when he's sleeping.
It's very voyeuristic.
It's creepy shit.
And he's disturbed by it as well. Like one of the first scenes in which the two interact, he asks for proof that Celliers has been mistreated by his guards. And so Celliers pulls his shirt off and shows these injuries that have been inflicted upon him, and the look on Yanoi's face in that, again fantastically played by Sakamoto here, is this strange mix of revulsion and desire and horror and just these strange feelings, and he demands immediately that you put his shirt back on. It's so well played.
Celliers and Yanoi never really speak to each other in this film. There's some trading of barbs, some uncomfortable staring, but nothing you could really call a conversation in the vein of what you see between Lawrence and Hara. And it's one of those great tragic ironies of Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, because if they ever did actually sit down and talk, they likely would have found they had a lot in common. Much like Yanoi, Celliers is driven by past failures, by the things he did not do. He chose not to defend his younger brother from a rather brutal initiation ritual at the private school they both attended, something that permanently tarnished their relationship and left Celliers with long-lasting regrets. Lawrence, acting as this confessor-like figure to both Yanoi and Celliers, is the only man who can see the parallels and similarities between the two of them, these strange and inspiring leaders who are driven by their past regrets. Despite the difference in cultures, despite their being on opposite sides of the war, Lawrence can see the commonalities between these men.
We need to talk about the other kind of important character in this film, which is Sergeant Gengo Hara, played by Takeshi Kitano, aka Beat Takashi. Hara is probably the second most important character in this because it's the relationship between Mr. Lawrence and Hara that defines so much of this. He is the guy who utters the title line, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. When Hara's first introduced, he comes across as like your archetypal, brutal Japanese guard. Like he demands that Lawrence gets out of bed. When someone steps up to question it further, he just beats the piss out of the guy and just splits his face open with a stick. And you think, okay, brutal Japanese guard. And he is that, but he is also capable of all of these human traits that make him a character instead of a stereotype. Like there are points where he and Lawrence are just about friends, to be quite honest with you. Like they're joking, they're back and forth, they're having these quite philosophical discussions. There's this real sense of camaraderie between the two, and then it can just switch in a moment, and Hara is kicking the shit out of Lawrence in a couple scenes as well. And they have this like quite interesting discussion between the two of them. Like Hara specifically says to him that I would respect you more, I would like you more if you'd killed yourself when you were captured. It's that embodiment of these two outlooks on war and on soldiers and what they are meant to be, because Lawrence the whole time is telling Hara, I've got nothing to be ashamed of. I will not always be a prisoner. I will fight you again. Whereas Hara specifically tells him, like, I made an oath to the Emperor that I would give my life for him. As far as I'm concerned, I'm already dead. So he says that he thinks less of Lawrence and, it would be better if you died and you're a coward and all these sort of things as well. And this is my take, the sort of the big climactic, a high point of the movie before everything goes tits up, is where this radio has been found in the block that Lawrence and Celliers have been staying on. And Lawrence and Celliers are blamed for this. They're taken, they're beaten, they nearly escape. There's almost a fight before Celliers doesn't fight Yanoi, and then the two are about to be executed for having this radio, before a drunk Hara calls them into his office, proclaims himself to be Father Christmas, releases the two of them and goes, Merry Christmas, Lawrence, and like just sends him on his way. In the next scene, Yanoi is horrified by the fact that Hara has released these two prisoners. He's like, what the fuck, you were supposed to have shot them last night. And Hara, looking rather sheepish, says that a Chinese prisoner, quote unquote, confessed to actually having the radio, and I've executed him, so it's all dealt with. I sorted it all out for you, boss, don't worry about it. I don't think there was a Chinese prisoner.
Okay.
I think that Hara is trying to protect Lawrence and Celliers by proxy. I think he has invented this to protect someone that, though he does not want to admit it, he is actually very fond of and does not want to die. Celliers, you kind of know that this is only going to end one way. That level of self-destructiveness and self-loathing and that urge, and even like this idea that he already feels like he's died already, that's only going to end one way. After he steps steps in to ironically protect Hixley, the guy who Yanoi wants him to replace as, the commander of the prisoners in the camp. Celliers kind of steps in and it's almost fucking messianic in some ways. Like a wanky video essayist could write a really, really, I don't know if interesting is the right word, but you could definitely write a script about how there's this kind of messianic quality to Celliers at points, and like all the sort of religious iconography that you see throughout the film, and this religious music that's playing in points as well. He kind of does a bit of a Jesus and steps up and sacrifices himself for the sake of this other soldier, because he does that whole thing where he like kisses Yanoi on the cheeks, which causes Yanoi to have an emotional breakdown.
And it's weird as well, because it's slowed down, if I remember rightly, but he like kisses him on each cheek. Before he's able to kill Hixley, he collapses, he gets relieved from his duty.
At which point a new commanding officer is brought in, and I seem to remember, I'm not really familiar with the guy, but he's like this old Japanese actor who's famous for playing scary Yakuza guys. This guy kind of represents the real brutal commanders that you got in some cases of the Pacific War, and this guy just comes in and is like, this Celliers guy, he's causing some issues, make an example. At which point Celliers is buried alive. We then move forward 4 years later to 1946, and we have a bit of a role reversal going on. Lawrence has been liberated from the camp. He's now visiting his old pal Hara, who's ironically, in it again, that twist of circumstance, is now a prisoner of the Allies. Hara, in addition to learning to speak English, has been sentenced to be executed the following day when Lawrence visits him for war crimes. But there's this, again, that interesting sense of regret that both characters have. Hara, I think, specifically mentions at one point in this scene, like, I'm ready to die, but I don't understand why they want to kill me. Like, I don't think I did anything other than what is expected of a soldier such as myself. Lawrence tells him,
You are the victim of men who think they are right. Just as one day, you and Captain Yanoi believed absolutely that you were right, and the truth is, of course, that nobody is right. Basically, the film depicts that this is one of the few war films where war itself is not depicted as anything heroic, just merely a misfortune that has occurred to these men.
War is a series of catastrophes that results in a victory.
Yes.
That's, I feel, kind of the outlook that Lawrence has reached at the end of this.
The interesting thing with the Japanese war crimes trials is they're very different from like Nuremberg. Nuremberg was like the top men were trialed, like commanders and politicians and all these things. With the Japanese, there were men that were executed for like committing war crimes that were just men who were manning anti-aircraft guns that shot down prisoners of war. So like this, where Hara is depicted as being this violent, brutal man in the film, his actions aren't uncommon for the entirety of all Japanese prisoners of war camps. So the way this film depicts it is like the violence was so commonplace. Why is he being singled out and executed when he views what he did as being normal? Which is kind of an interesting way to look at it for a war criminal, shall we say.
And a remarkably nuanced take for 1983, given that the scholarship that you're reading just now, these are points that are being made in some cases by Sarah Kovner in her book that I was mentioning earlier. She wrote that in 2020. This is a movie in 1983 making some very, very coherent points about who we chose to focus on in the wake of the Pacific War. I think that Hara saves the life of Lawrence, and I think what you're seeing there in that final scene is Lawrence pretty distraught that he can't quite do the same for the man who did that for him. And Hara's kind of okay with that, almost. Like he says, he's ready to die. He doesn't really understand the circumstances of it, but he's made his peace with it. And it's why in the final scene, it's not a man in tears, it's not a man breaking down, it's a man smiling and hearkening back to this, not happier time, but this happier moment between the two of them, when he once again goes, "Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence." And fuck me, it's beautiful and very, very sad.
It's such a hard film to talk about because it's like a fever dream. It's the only way to depict it. Because like the first time I watched it, I was just blown away by like the soundtrack, how beautiful it was. It's a 2-hour long film is the other thing. Like it's a long film where nothing happens in a good way because it's just this exploration of these relationships, these characters. There's no action scene. Like if you made this film now, there would be the scene where like Celliers and his native soldiers blew up a train before he got captured. There would be bollocks like that, and then like David Bowie's character would have been rescued by, like fuck knows what. And yeah, it's just such a brutal, sad film set at Christmas.
No, I loved it. I really did. It made me very sad, but it's not the kind of movie that you expect to be made in the early 1980s in terms of how willing it is to explore difficult subjects in terms of this conflict and this war. And this was a very, very sore subject still in the 1980s. It's a sore subject now. And just how willing they were to face it head on and explore both the Allied perspective and the Japanese perspective as well, and try and reach these quite interesting conclusions. It's one of a kind. I don't really have too many negatives of it. I think the one thing that I could probably mention is the scenes where Celliers is kind of having this flashback to his time in school. And
they
his
feel
betrayal.
so weird, but then...
I think it kind of works, though.
Yeah.
I think it's meant to be kind of dreamlike and strange.
That's the thing. That's what I was going to say. It just feels so odd.
Yeah, David Bowie, very clearly not a schoolboy in a schoolboy uniform next to his kid brother, who's still his kid brother. Initially, it threw me off, and then I realized, oh, wait, no,
It's supposed to be weird.
This is how Celliers still sees himself, and this is how he still sees his brother.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's really well done, but I also think it's an odd way to do it. But then nowadays, you'd CGI Bowie to look younger, so like, maybe it's...
Yeah, no, it could be worse.
Maybe it's for the best. Hey Dave, do you know what the most important thing about this video is? Do you know what I've not mentioned throughout the entire recording once?
That is true. We've not had a single reference to Ghostwatch.
True. It's not a single reference at all.
Or Star Trek, for that matter. Yeah.
Now let me tell you about the Star Trek Voyager episode. That's exactly...
To conclude, if you want a quasi-Christmas movie that will really, really bum you out and make you think about like sad stuff and also quite insightful and nuanced stuff, this might be one of the best war movies ever made.
I think it is the best movies ever made, as well as being one of the best war movies.
I'm annoyed with myself for putting up watching this as long as I did, because I kind of want to go back and watch it again now. I think melancholic and thoughtful would be the way I would describe it in terms of its outlooks and its way it approaches its subject matter. Like, it is a sad movie, but it's not like just trying to make you a bit bummed out. It's trying to make you quite wistful and thoughtful in addition to being sad. 10 out of 10. 100%. Great movie.
I mean, it's one of Akira Kurosawa's favorite films.
Rob, do you have any parting thoughts?
Just take this into consideration. David Bowie's film career, other than this film, I think is practically not even worth talking about.
Well, he did. Okay.
Labyrinth.
Labyrinth is a classic. The greatest bulge in cinematic history. How is this in a child's movie? What the fuck?
Thanks, Jim Henson. He is in Twin Peaks, and it's fucking great.
Is he indeed?
He's in the first movie, and then he appeared posthumously in the sequel series.
We really need to do our second video on Twin Peaks soon.
But I really don't want to talk about the second season of Twin Peaks.
Too bad.